Joining BYU Sports Nation right now, CBS Sports college football insider and writer Tom Fornelli. Tom, welcome to BYU Sports Nation.
Thanks for having me. Taylor Swift was just here in Chicago the other day, and I missed it as well, so I know how you feel.
Yeah, it's an issue. It's plaguing the nation. Not enough tickets for
my summer's been ruined. Yeah.
We're off to a rip-roaring start. Taylor Swift has now been mentioned twice in the show today, show number 500. We're with Tom Fornelli of CBS Sports. Tom, you put BYU in an interesting list the other day in an article that you wrote, the most disrespected college football programs in the country. BYU came in at number 4 on that list. Why did you feel like they belonged in that list?
For when I was putting the list together, it was relatively easy for me to figure out the team I was putting at number 1, which ended up being at Missouri. And then after that, I had, 10 candidates I was trying to figure out, who was more disrespected than the other. And what really settled it for me with BYU to include them in the list was just in the recent years we've seen, now that the playoff exists, Power 5 conferences are mandating rules where teams have to play one non-conference game against another Power 5 opponent. And there was the whole debate in the ACC and the SEC about whether BYU should count as a Power 5 non-conference opponent. And to me, it was a silly debate because if you just look at what BYU has done as a football program, it won the national title in 1984, but even in the last 30 years, it's had success in the WAC, it had success in the Mountain West, and it's had success as an independent. But since Bronco Mendenhall's taken over, this is a team that's won 10 games 5 times. It's never won less than 6 in any single season. So it's been a strong program. It was having a very strong year last year before Taysom Hill got injured. And it's like, it just blew my mind that, say you're Alabama, you could schedule Kansas, and that would automatically meet the requirement for a Power 5 just because it plays in the Big 12. With BYU, there was a question behind it. It didn't make sense to me. To me, it was an obvious choice that I would rather my team play BYU. That's going to look better on my resume than a Kansas would or a Wake Forest would. Of course, it should be considered a Power 5 non-conference.
What were some of the ultimate pieces of criteria that went into, okay, this team over this team in terms of disrespect? There was definitely some recency bias. I mean, I put Mississippi State at 5, and I feel like long-term, Mississippi State's probably not one of the most disrespected, programs in the country because it's generally been bad most of the time. But just coming off last year, where it was ranked, number 1 in the AP poll for 5 weeks. It was the first team ever ranked number 1 in the college football playoff rankings. And then you look at SEC Media Days last week when the media predictions for the SEC West comes out, there's Mississippi State picked to finish last in the division. So it was stuff like that. It's for, just teams that have done well recently or for a long time that we just never seem to quite take seriously enough. That was really what drove when I came to the 5 teams, and it's just looking for one impact thing, like I mentioned with the BYU as a Power 5 or Mississippi State being picked to finish last in the SEC West, or even Georgia Tech, a team that, aside from Virginia Tech and Florida State, no ACC team has appeared in more ACC championship games than Georgia Tech. Yet every year they're kind of discounted simply because they run an option offense, and it's not fun or exciting, even though I enjoy it. But they're always discounted because of it. But then, as we saw last year, they went 10-3, won the Orange Bowl, and this year, I'll be surprised. I won't be shocked at all if you're seeing Georgia Tech pick to finish 2nd or 3rd in the Coastal Division instead of winning the division, even though it's been to more division title or conference title games than the rest of its division combined. You look at a team like Kansas State, who under Bill Snyder has always been a very solid team, but when you come to picking the Big 12, it's always Oklahoma and Texas, or now it's TCU and Baylor, and nobody ever really considers Kansas State. No matter how many times they're winning 10 games, no matter how many great seasons they have, Kansas State's always just kind of they'll finish 4th or 5th. This year they're picked to finish 7th. And then Missouri, I felt it was just very obvious. I mean, the Missouri Tigers have won the SEC East the last 2 years, and nobody, it's since they're the new kid on the block in the SEC, everybody just wants to discount them. Well, it's kind of a fluke. The SEC East has been down, blah, blah, blah. But, you look this year, Missouri, after winning the last 2 SEC East Division titles, is picked to finish 3rd in the division behind Georgia, which is a fine pick. I completely understand picking Georgia to win the division. But having Tennessee 2nd, when Tennessee hasn't won more than 7 games in nearly 10 years, all of a sudden you've got the Vols being better than Missouri. It just doesn't make sense to me. It was more of a common sense type. These teams are good, yet we never really recognize how good they are.
Tom Fornelli, college football writer for CBSSports.com, with us on BYU Sports Nation. as I look at how the media is portraying BYU right now, we're getting the overwhelming impression that a lot of the media are favoring BYU if the Big 12 expands for them to go to that Power 5 conference, and that BYU is a deserving candidate. So is the disrespect that BYU is facing and that you were writing about primarily from the regents in the Power 5 conferences that are not inviting BYU?
Yeah, I think that certainly plays a role in the way BYU is viewed, simply because now, especially as an independent, it was in the Mountain West and the WAC, and now with the Big 12, it's a possibility to expand, but it's hard. For BYU, I feel like had they always been in a Power 5 conference, there wouldn't be nearly as much, they'd be recognized for how strong they've been, simply because it's just human nature, the way it comes to being a college football fan, that you tend to elevate the teams that are in the major conferences just because, you're more familiar with them. You see them everywhere. They're talked about more often. But I think that BYU, it's just, if you look at their schedule this year, this is a team to me, they don't run from anybody, especially now that they're an independent and they've got freedom to fill out whoever they want to play. I mean, they've got Nebraska on the schedule, Boise State, UCLA, Michigan, Missouri, and then you've got tough games against Utah State and, Fresno State. And it's just, this is a team that doesn't run from anybody, and it hasn't for a few years. And more often than not, when it's playing these tough games, they're winning them, especially when they're healthy. As we saw last year with Taysom Hill before he went down with an injury, this is a team that was on pace to have a very good season. And if they have that kind of year again in 2015, you look at that schedule, this is a team to me that would be considered a playoff contender if it somehow manages to get through it, because it'd be hard to argue over the resume that they're putting up with the teams that they'd be beating, particularly Nebraska, UCLA, and Michigan on the road. If they somehow won those 3 games, it'd be insane. As far as Big 12 inclusion, I agree. If the Big 12 does look to expand, and while the tea leaves read different now because, as Bob Bowlesby said during Big 12 Media Days this week, the majority of the school's presidents are against expanding at the moment. What matters to me is the Big 12 goes as Oklahoma and Texas go. Those are the 2 driving forces in that conference, and the most vocal proponent for expansion happens to be David Boren, the president of Oklahoma. And I feel like the louder he gets, the more Oklahoma starts wanting to expand, the more likely the Big 12 at some point in the future will expand. And the Big 12, maybe it's for its own benefit to be more proactive when it comes to expansion this time around, because as we saw during the last set of musical chairs, the Big 12 was the conference that was getting poached by just about everybody else and was left scrambling to fill, get back to 10 teams. So I would think that if the Big 12 wanted to take a more proactive approach, I think BYU would be a very good target for it, simply because you're getting a strong football program, that, and you're also getting, a nice market in Utah and a large fan base over the country. So I think it would be a smart move for the Big 12 to consider BYU. I would take BYU over a Cincinnati or a Memphis or another one of these programs that, they have, cable boxes, maybe, the television sets, which everybody loves, but really don't bring the kind of strength to the conference as a football program that BYU could. And especially now, in the day and age where we have the selection committee like we do in basketball, picking the teams that get to the playoff, which will likely expand to 8 teams again at some point in the future, it's nice to have stronger programs in your conference simply because it boosts your reputation overall, and you're not stuck in a position like you were last year when both Oklahoma and Texas have a down year, and the 2 teams that you're choosing from aren't brand names in TCU and Baylor, which makes it somewhat easier for the selection committee to pass over you. But if you add more strong programs to your conference and you build up that reputation, suddenly the TCUs and the Baylors become stronger brands themselves. The BYU is a stronger brand, and it's easier for the Big 12 to make sure it's getting included in that playoff every year, and then that's when all the money comes in.
Tom, I look at BYU and this schedule, and it is daunting, especially because a lot of those games are on the road, the tough games. Is BYU, would they be better suited to play an easier schedule and rack up a couple more wins and hope that they play a couple tough games and win a few of those like the old Boise State model? Or ramp up and then try and be relevant through 8-5 or 9-4 likely, and that'd be pretty good with a couple of good wins? What does more for BYU?
I would say that it's nice to have a schedule like you have this year, especially if you win the games, but I don't know if I'm BYU if I want to play this schedule every year. Like the first 4 games of the season are very tough. Like we mentioned, the 3 road trips to Nebraska, UCLA, and Michigan with a home game against Boise State sandwiched in between. That's a very tough way for anybody to start the season, not just BYU. And it's nice because you're going to get, if you win these games, you're going to get the recognition and you're going to look more attractive, to the Big 12 or to anybody really nationally, just when it comes to the playoff and all that kind of stuff. But I would say overall, you probably want to lean more consistently towards that Boise State kind of model, where you want to make sure you're putting up 10-win seasons year after year, which BYU has been doing a generally good job of under Bronco Mendenhall. There's been 5 10-win seasons in it since he's gotten there. So you want to keep doing that, and then you got to get to what really set Boise State in motion was getting to that Fiesta Bowl and beating Oklahoma in the fashion it did. All of a sudden, overnight, Boise State became cool. I mean, they were winning games, but they didn't really have that kind of attention that they weren't really garnering the kind of attention for the wins they were putting up every year. It wasn't until they won that huge game against Oklahoma where everybody kind of stepped back and said, oh, we got something real here. So I think BYU, maybe you're talking about, picking your bowl game for 2015. I think another thing that could benefit BYU if it plays well this year is maybe getting a more attractive bowl contract with bigger bowls where they'll have a chance to play bigger opponents. Although, like you mentioned, I think a Las Vegas Bowl between BYU and Utah would be very fun to watch. I just don't know what it would move the needle, nationally if BYU beats Utah in that game.
Tom Fornelli, college football writer for CBSSports.com on BYU Sports Nation. Follow him on Twitter at Tom Fornelli. One more question for you, Tom, and this deals with the over-under on the win total for BYU in 2015. ESPN said a projected 7-5. Other publications, Phil Steele, say 7.5, around 8. Jerem thinks 8. I know BYU fans are hoping for double-digit wins. What is your projection for BYU in terms of wins and losses in the regular season?
I think if Tate Smith stays healthy, I'd go 8, maybe even 9 if things break right. It's going to be hard with the schedule we've talked about a few times. It's going to be really hard to get to 10 wins against that schedule unless you just have a magical season where everything breaks your way. But I would say 8-4 for regular season sounds about right to me, and I would say 7-5 at worst.
Tom, great stuff. Great to talk to you, and hopefully the next time we talk, BYU is not still one of the most disrespected college football programs in the country.
I hope so as well. Thanks for having me on today, guys.
You got it. Thanks, Tom.